Welcome back to History 1302. Today's lecture is over World War II. And for this portion, I am going to be introducing our objectives and basically give you a little introduction to what fascism is, as well as what the American position was as the conflict, began to take hold all over the world. So let's begin. The questions to consider today, first of all, is why were most Americans initially opposed to entering the war, and what ended up changing their minds? The other thing that we have to consider as well is what were the major differences for the U.S. between the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. And then we're going to talk about in what ways did World War II alter life for the Americans who remained at home. Then we'll move on to what alternatives were available for ending the war in Europe and in the Pacific, and why did the U.S. choose the strategies that it employed to end the war. Lastly, we are going to be looking at what were the international and domestic consequences of the war. So first things first, let's talk about what is fascism. Right? And we're going to go ahead and put it in the European context as well. Now, the thing about World War II is that, a lot of people are going to say that this was the last quote unquote good war, because it was very clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, right? But it gets a little bit complicated when we start talking about fascism. Fascism is a word that gets thrown around a lot today. And so I want to take a couple minutes to discuss it, define it, so that we clearly know what it is and why it's problematic. And not only that, but why these countries had to essentially stand up to it and do something about it before it got any worse. So let's talk about fascism, okay? Now, fascism is a very complicated topic, but these are just 6 or 7 of the just most basic fundamental tenets of fascism. Number 1, fascist governments believe in the supremacy of the state over that of the individual. And what that means is that everything is about how this benefits the state and not the individual. Okay, so your personal rights, freedoms, liberties, whatever, comes secondary to that of what is in the best interest of the nation. Okay, the supremacy of the state is the most important thing in a fascist government. Number 2, a fascist government by definition is a dictatorship. Okay, it is run by dictators who say, I'm in charge here. There is no there's no mistaking that at all. Okay, and especially when it comes to German fascism, it works on the leadership principle where everybody's working towards the Führer, right? For the Führer, everything to make the Führer happy, moving upwards towards the Führer. Okay, but it gets better or worse. Number 3, authoritarian government is one that suppresses freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. In essence, it dictates to you what to believe. And so what do I mean by this, right? What does that mean in an authoritarian fascist dictatorship? There is no freedom of speech, press, or religion. Well, basically what happens here is that there's an extreme limitation on the freedom of choice in a fascist government. They essentially tell you what is acceptable, what is not. The religion becomes the Führer, right? Or the government, right? The interests of the nation. The press, there's no free press. There's no freedom of the press. There's no freedom of speech. If you say something that goes against what, the leader of the country is saying, guess what happens? You get thrown in jail, or you get fired, or, they call for your dismissal. They make you disappear, essentially, right? I mean, you lose your way of life, your livelihood, or your life even, right, as things get worse. And the press, this is another thing as well that The press is becomes an enemy of the state when they start to print stories that are negative about, the president, or, the dictator, or the Führer. In this case, I say all of those things because fascism rises not just in Germany, but in other parts of the world as well. And so when the newspapers, the media starts printing stories about, what is going on and how this is a danger to society, those journalists, those newspapers, get thrown in jail or get shut down. And like I said, they get named enemies of the state, right? I mean, it's in Germany, they call it Lügenpresse, right? Fake media, fake news, right? So it's not something new. It's actually been around for a while. Number 4, fascist governments believe in a state-run and oriented economy. What this means is that there is no pretense of a free market economy here, right? The government is run by and for the state, right? So all of these different corporations and industries are all essentially nationalized and run by the government, for the country, for, the interest of the nation. Number 5, fascist governments by definition are militaristic. And what this means is that it's essentially, the whole thing is set up where it's about building up the military, adding guns, adding weapons. The whole purpose of it is to build up the nation, build up its citizens, on this idea of, going to war, right? It's about keeping the nation ready, preparing them for everything that they do is about getting the country prepared, right? Having them on that footing to go to war. And this includes everybody, men, women, children, the youth, everybody is has the same kind of mentality, has the same purpose, okay? Number 6, there's a strong nationalist sentiment. What this means is that there is, it's all about what's in the interest of the country, right? There is a willingness here as well to use police surveillance, terror, the use of violence, to keep others in line, that maybe, marginalized groups that are not a part of this nationalist vision. There is absolutely, right, and this ties in with the need for the enemy. There is absolutely the need for the other, okay, the enemy, like you are not one of us, right? And we are all a part of this, oneness, this national identity. We are all together. And so those that are not, right, these marginalized groups are the ones that are going to be excluded through laws and other measures that they do, either, something so simplistic, even though it's, insidious in nature, but, firing them from their jobs, right? Excluding them that way, socially outcasting them, not allowing them to live in certain neighborhoods, not allowing them to have a passport, right? Simply because they do not match this ethnic identity. And so it is not simply just that, we are, for example, I'm going to use the United States as an example, right? That we are all United States citizens because we were born here, right? Despite of your ethnic or religious background. But then they start saying, well, only, certain groups that fit this criteria or fit a certain kind of look or that are not of this particular religion can be considered U.S. citizens, and everybody else is going to be excluded, meaning they will not be allowed to have a U.S. passport or allowed to live in these neighborhoods or allowed to teach at university or allowed to, play music or whatever, right? That sort of thing. And so this plays out all over Europe, okay? This is only a part of what fascism is. And the truth of all of this is that, these governments where fascism rises, these governments thrive on these conditions, okay? It is absolutely incredibly just, wow, interesting how people allow for this to happen, either because the economic conditions are just beyond, comprehension, beyond their control. Things have just sort of spiraled so out of control that the alternative seems like a good idea. And so part of what happens here ties into World War One, or the end of World War One. Okay. After World War One, there's so much economic and social upheaval, a lot of uncertainty. Remember, this is at the end of World War One. It's like the end of empires, right? The end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of what used to be Germany, right? I mean, the Prussian Empire. Germany was split essentially into two geographic locations. Poland popped out of nowhere. Russia stopped being Russia. It is now a communist country. A lot of weird stuff is happening, right? The Kaiser from Germany abdicated. A lot of really weird stuff is happening. And people are unsure of what the future holds, in particular in Germany, okay? So in Germany, it's a new democratic government. There's a lot of economic unrest. There's a lot of people that are still waiting for jobs and stuff like that. There's also like the shadow of World War One, right? I mean, of having lived through that and experienced it, the great amount of pain and suffering and just unnecessary loss of life, and all for what, right? So there's a lot of people questioning many things. And in Germany in particular, when those old traditions and restrictions on society went away and loosened up, something interesting happened. Society flourished. And in places like Weimar, Berlin, right? The Weimar Republic. This is this period, right, that we're talking about here. The Weimar Republic is like a hat tip to the Constitution, right? The new German democratic government. But something very interesting happened here, where society just really kind of flourished in several places. And Berlin became like a cosmopolitan epicenter. In many ways it replaced Paris and London as a place that attracted, intellectuals and the arts, and it was really fantastic. I'm getting like goosebumps just thinking about it. And unfortunately, kind of like what we saw in the United States happened during the 20s, right? Which is essentially the same thing that's happening here too. There is this conservative backlash, and there are people all over Germany, all over these countries, but especially in Germany, that do not like what is happening. They don't like the way that society is defining itself. They don't like, men, women running around and all of the loose morals and stuff like that. And a lot of that sentiment comes from people in the countryside, because in the cities, I mean, it's some of the most tolerant and accepting places. They're vibrant and exciting, and there's the arts and the music and the dancing and the cabarets and the shows, and it is utterly fabulous and fantastic. But there is this movement that is creeping among, the rural parts of the country, where as the economy gets worse, people are calling for change. And, this is where, the rise to fascism comes in. In the United States, the U.S. is going through the Great Depression, but there is a worldwide economic collapse, okay? That is a particular element to that contributes to the rise of fascism in places like Italy, Spain, and Germany, and others as well, but we don't have time to talk about that. So the worse the economy gets, the easier it becomes for some people to accept fascism as an alternative to the current government. Okay. One of the things that I want to mention about this is that when it comes to the United States and, the reaction from FDR and the Democrats in Congress, is that, he gets called a lot of names, right? He gets called a socialist and all kinds of things. He doesn't care, right? I call him a traitor to his class. He doesn't care. He is adamant that if he doesn't act decisively enough, if he doesn't act in a way that is dramatic, he could potentially be the last American president. And what that means is that he's afraid that our democracy, our country as we know it, would have come to an end because of how bad things were. If the people lose faith in the system, if the people lose faith in the government, if the people start to believe that the government doesn't care, that is where the danger comes from. With the amount of people that were out of work, that were hungry, with as bad as the situation was, when FDR comes into office, he tries many radical things, right, that he gets a lot of flack for, and honestly, it is controversial. But he knows that if he doesn't do it, the consequences could be worse. Okay. The difference here is that in places like Italy, with Benito Mussolini, Italy, Germany, and Spain, they kind of like allow it to happen. Okay. The worse the economy gets, the easier it is for these guys to climb to power. Okay. So let's talk about Mussolini first. Okay. Italy is interesting. Okay. Because like I said, you really cannot understand what's going on in Europe in the 30s as fascism is rising without understanding the economic conditions that contributed to this problem. Okay. So it's the economy, stupid, right? It's like this, that's a phrase from like the 80s, right? But it really does apply to what is happening here. So let's talk about what's happening in Italy. First of all, Italy was fascist for more than 10 years before Hitler was. Okay. Benito Mussolini. First of all, fascism is an Italian. It's a Roman, ideology. The whole fascism is Italian. It's Roman. Okay. So Hitler did not come up with that. Hitler basically copied it. Well, he copied a lot of things like the swastika, but nevertheless, Hitler didn't have an original idea ever. But anyways, let's talk about Benito Mussolini. Mussolini became the leader of Italy in 1922. By the way, he's named after Benito Juarez, the revolutionary from Mexico, right? Yeah. Anyways, so Italy had been on the Allies side, right, in World War I. But Italy wasn't a nation until 1848. Okay, so they're relatively new. And they had a tendency to fight among themselves, right? So after World War I, they had a bit of an economic downturn. But Mussolini was trusted by the people who were struggling economically. And they believed that this was more important than several of their rights or freedoms. So they were actually willing to give up some of their, constitutional freedoms for a better running government, a better economy. The other thing I want you to consider as well is that Italy had imperial ambitions. Remember, they wanted an empire. They wanted parts of Austria-Hungary, but they ended up walking empty-handed. So when Mussolini comes into power, he wanted to set a course to conquer Africa. Okay, so Italy is going to conquer Ethiopia, right, or also known as Abyssinia, in 1935. And Mussolini saw this as an opportunity to provide land for unemployed Italians and also acquire more mineral resources to fight off the effects of the Great Depression, right? So the effects here would have been twofold, okay? So I want you to look at this picture and sort of burn it in your mind that this is who Benito Mussolini is, right? He was the fascist dictator, right? He was the guy that Adolf Hitler looked up to, that wanted to be like, okay? And it's just really kind of interesting how by the end of the war, his own people are going to essentially turn against him, okay? But we'll talk more about that later down the road. Let's talk about what's going on in Spain. Spain, again, super, super interesting. This is another one of these fascist governments in Spain. Spain, after, Spain is in an interesting situation because they are going to be going into civil war between 1936 and 1939. And again, it's born out of the economic distress. Okay. The fascists are going to control the country, right? And they are run, it's essentially like a military coup here. But this is, what's his name? Franco, right? Francisco Franco, that's his name. Generalissimo Francisco Franco. And what's interesting here, it's like the civil war in Spain, right? Remember, it's from 1936 to 1939. It's almost like a scrimmage before actual, World War II takes on, because you've got the fascists, Hitler is going to send aerial support and troops and stuff like that to Franco so that he can stay in power. And then you also have the communist in there, right? So Leon Trotsky is out there, helping the communist faction. Then you also have socialists and anarchists, and then the monarchists, right? Because Spain had a monarch. So it is like, a brawl going on. It's really bad. And like I said, the United States doesn't actually get involved, not directly anyways. There's certain embargoes that happen here as well. But for the most part, there is like a group of like American college students and really like highly idealistic young men that go off to fight for the socialist faction, and they call themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So anyways, this is, like I said, like a pre-game like a scrimmage between all of these countries, and it is just brutal, the kind of fighting with the firepower that they have, and it's really just a preview of what's going to happen in World War II. Much worse things that are going to happen. Interestingly enough, Franco is going to stay in power until the 1970s, in part because he remained neutral during World War II, right? Hitler doesn't see him as a threat. And that's kind of interesting how he's able to stay in power for so long. But anyways, let's talk about what's going on with the United States. And this is where I want to leave off. Prior to talking about, Hitler getting elected and the moves that he's going to make to break away with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. So let's talk about the American position once World War I breaks out. Okay, there are four main things that you should know, right? Like the reasons why the United States doesn't get involved right away. The first one is the American, the memory of World War I. Remember, it was a brutal war. Immediately following that, not just the United States, but people around the world became, isolationists. They didn't want to be involved in a war like that again. A lot of people had become pacifists as well. And so the thought of having like another world war on that scale with that many casualties and that many countries involved just really turned the Americans off. And as you're going to see in one of the lectures today, is that they're going to do everything that it takes to try to prevent the U.S. from getting entangled in another world war. So the memory of the war is one of the reasons why the United States wants to stay out of this. Even though, Hitler and some of these other fascists are becoming a growing threat. Every day it gets worse. So that's number one. Number two, the Great Depression. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean, we have a lot of problems going on at home. Okay, we are in the midst of an economic collapse. We've got, the highest number of people unemployed, out of work, ever. It's like, in other words, we've got lots of things to worry about at home. The last thing we can do is, start looking at what's going on in the world, right? We need to focus. We need to help our own people. Things are bad, right? It's like code blue. Okay, so the Depression is another reason why the United States doesn't want to get involved. Number 3, and this one might be kind of a surprise, might come as a shock to you, but Americans had an incredible amount of respect for Hitler. Like, unbelievable respect for him. Why? Well, because he seemed at least to be a great politician. He seemed to have, his people's support. When he made promises to bring, to will the German economy out of the Depression, by sheer will, he did it. It seemed that way, right? And he delivered on these promises. He had the German people's support. He seemed to be a great politician. I mean, he was like Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1936. Look it up if you don't believe me. And so when all of these other little things start coming out, all of these little rumors, and a lot of people look at that and they go, yeah, but that's over there. And he seems like a great guy. And he seems to have his people's support. And, why would we get involved? Why should we tell another politician from a foreign country what to do? I mean, like I said, they had an incredible amount of respect for him. And so they kind of let him be. Okay. Number 4. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 4. Another reason why the United States does not want to get involved in the coming war is plain and simple anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, if you don't know what this is hate, disdain, prejudice for people that are Jewish. Obviously, you know that Hitler didn't like German Jews. He didn't want them in his country. He wanted them out. He blamed them for everything. All kinds of like conspiracy theories and just rubbish about the Jews. But when it comes to the United States, people in the United States, and really people all over the world, anti-Semitism was, how can I explain this without sounding crude or, I mean, there's really no way to sugarcoat this, but anti-Semitism was socially acceptable. So like if you said something that was discriminatory to somebody because they were Jewish, like nobody would bat an eye. It was almost like people using the N-word, prior to the civil rights movement. Like that was socially acceptable. You wouldn't do that today. But that was a problem. And so when people looked at what was happening in Germany, right, where they're trying to expel the Jews out of Germany. Mind you, these are German citizens. These are people that are Germans. They might be Jewish, but they've been totally assimilated to German society and traditions and everything. But nevertheless, they start, with Kristallnacht and they start taking away their passports, and they start moving them out of their neighborhoods and into these, ghettos. And when these rumors and news are coming out of Germany and the Americans are hearing about it, they look at it and it's like, yeah, well, what are we going to do? We're going to go to war over Jews? It just doesn't make any sense to them. Because again, anti-Semitism was socially acceptable. In fact, let me put it to you this way. If you weren't anti-Semitic, people thought that was kind of odd. Right? Like, they thought that was weird. There's plenty of people in history during this time that, remember, they were believers in they were believers in eugenics. right? Like racial hierarchy theories, because they believed it was science. And just like that, anti-Semitism was widely acceptable. And so when it comes to, the getting closer and closer towards going to war, Americans look at it, and because of anti-Semitism, they don't want to get involved. They don't want to get involved. So think about all those things, all right? Because it's going to take a lot to get the United States to do a 180 on isolationism. And so that is going to be the topic of the next discussion, especially, once I set the tone for what happens in Germany. So be on the lookout for that one. All of the lectures in this unit are going to be about 10 minutes long. I don't know how long this one is, but since it's the introduction, there's plenty of stuff that I wanted to cover. But all of the other videos from here on out are going to be about 10 minutes long. So just follow them in chronological order, and let me know if you have any questions. Okay? So I'll see you on the next one, guys. Bye.